language acquisition, as opposed to the deliberate learning of languages, language acquisition is a natural process. And we learn through input from language content that we are able to absorb in some way. That's how we transfer a language which we don't have inside us, we bring it into us. But in order for that to work, there have to be some linkages, some connections. And today I want to talk about some of those connections and talk a bit about how I learned languages and what were the key connections, dare I say links, that brought me to the different languages that I have learned to different levels throughout my life. The first language that I deliberately sought to acquire was French, which I had at school, and so I had a lot of exposure, and we did grammar exercises and drills, but I couldn't speak until I had a professor, and I've told this story before, at McGill University, Professor Rabotin, who made French civilization interesting to me. There was a link there. There was a connection. As a result, I ended up going to France. I studied there for 3 years. I hitchhiked around France. So there was a connection. Now, it's easy to then connect from French to a neighboring language, neighboring in the sense of vocabulary and structure, which of course was Spanish. So with my French knowledge, I went to Spain, hitchhiked around in Spain. I would be sitting in a car with a driver or sitting in a truck with a truck driver, and I would have to speak the whole time. So the language was coming at me all the time. And even if I didn't quite understand what they were saying, I would say something to keep the conversation going, and I would acquire the language. So that connection there was from French to Spanish. And my hitchhiking took me to Italy, and I tried out my Spanish, and I got Italian back. And through that connection, I built up a bit of a sense of Italian. Ultimately, though, and I think this is an important point, we don't just fall into languages. A lot of effort is needed to learn languages, even related or neighboring languages. So I can remember buying a Linguaphone series, or maybe I got it secondhand, for Italian and listened to it over and over and over again, because I couldn't treat Italian as just some kind of form of Spanish. It's a different language, and it has a lot of idiosyncrasies of its own. Later on, I was to learn Portuguese to a certain level, and Romanian. I'll explain how I got there. But the thing about the Portuguese, which is so close to Spanish in vocabulary, in fact, for the longest time, I couldn't even identify it as Portuguese. Before I started studying it, it sounded to me more like Russian, because in the Portuguese, they kind of chew their vowels like the Russians do. So it's not obvious. That connection is there. It can be a source of attraction, but it doesn't mean you can just expect to learn the related language easily. So the next group of languages that I went to was Asian languages. Now, by Asian languages, I'm referring to Chinese, therefore Mandarin and Cantonese, and Japanese and Korean. Now, I learned Mandarin. I had a lot of trouble with Cantonese. I had to devote myself to learning Cantonese, even though the vocabulary is extremely similar, but the pronunciation is quite different. The writing system is the same. Essentially, Mandarin speakers tend to use simplified more. Cantonese speakers tend to use traditional more, but the difference between the two is not very great. But then it ended up that I moved to Japan. But here again, related languages only in the sense that they're part of the same culture, broadly speaking. And Japanese uses Chinese characters, but the underlying language, of course, is quite different. However, the attraction for me to learn Japanese is that I was living there. The attraction to learn Mandarin was that I was sent there to learn Chinese by my employer, the Canadian government. But while living in Japan, I said, Korea isn't far away. It also uses Chinese characters. It should be easy for me. So that was, again, the connection to Korean. I have never managed to do as well in Korean as I had hoped, again confirming the fact that even though there are similarities and there's a lot of shared vocabulary, it's a different language, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of listening, a lot of reading, and eventually a lot of speaking in order to become proficient in that language. Similarly, Vietnamese, I visited Vietnam with my wife and some friends, and it also has, I gather, a lot of Chinese words in their language, but I got nowhere. I grabbed a phrase book before going, and I wasn't able to say anything. So related languages can be a source of attraction. It doesn't mean it's a slam dunk to learn those languages. So after the Asian languages, which are grouped as Asian because they share vocabulary, they're geographically close to each other, but they are part of different language systems. Then I went to the Slavic system, and the link or the connection there was that as a teenager I had read The Idiot by Dostoevsky, Anna Karenina. It seemed so exotic, So I said, geez, I should learn that language. Plus, I want to do it without this tremendous focus on grammar that seems to be the style in teaching Russian. And so I learned Russian through a lot of input. Again, connections. For example, even, movies, videos that I couldn't really understand that well, it increased that connection, that emotional tie. I still remember Zhestoky Romance, which was one of the first Russian movies that I saw. And it was, the Volga, 19th century, was so romantic and exotic. And that was that connection again that pulled me towards the language. Similarly, I discovered this radio station, Echo Moskvy, which had all kinds of audio and text content on it that I could listen to daily and learn about politics in Russia while improving my Russian. After that, because, of course, Russian is a Slavic language, and my father and my parents were from Czechoslovakia, I said, I should learn Czech. And I discovered this wonderful radio program called Tolky Česko Minulosti, which talks about the history of the Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, and eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but even going back to the Holy Roman Empire, which was largely, of course, different parts of Germany and Austria. And having visited Prague, of course, it's all meaningful to me. And so I went from Russian to Czech, because there's a connection there, obviously. And while I was into my Russian period, then we had the events in Ukraine of 2014, and someone directed me towards Schuster Live, a TV program in Ukraine. At that time, the Ukrainians tended to speak 50% of the time in Russian, 50% of the time in Ukrainian. I couldn't understand the Ukrainians. Of course, I have tremendous sympathy for what they are trying to do to achieve genuine independence for their country. So then I went and learned Ukrainian. So that's still staying within that Slavic range, that connection from Russian to Czech, then to Ukrainian, and then to Polish, because a lot of the vocabulary in Ukrainian is similar to Polish vocabulary. And of course, Ukraine was under Poland for a long, long time, and culturally they were connected until a range of historical events changed the course of Ukrainian history, at least for parts of Ukraine. But with Ukraine and Poland now, we're in the Austro-Hungarian Empire again, so that kind of directs me towards Romanian, and which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I was doing business in Romania, so I decided to learn Romanian, but it's of course connected to the Romance languages, and it was quite easy to learn for that reason, although it has some grammatical structures that are different. One of the interesting grammatical structures in Romanian is this sort of double conjugation. In other words, in English, we use the infinitive, I want to go. In Romanian, they say, I want, I go. But they do that as well. In Greek, they do it apparently in other Balkan languages. So that's kind of interesting. So there was a connection, sort of a Balkan connection. And once we're in the Balkans, then with my wife, we were in Croatia. We also went to Crete. And of course, not only was Venice a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but of course the Venetians were very active in the Adriatic. So in Crete, they have these wonderful towns that are Venetian towns, but they speak Greek. And I learned my Greek for the period that we were in Crete. Now we're getting closer to Turkey, because even when we were in Croatia, we went up to Sarajevo, and the Turkish influence there is very evident in their buildings, in the structures. There's lots of mosques and that kind of thing. And there are still Turkish speakers in the Balkans. So now we move to the other side of the Hellespont. Because I visited Jordan, I got interested in Arabic, and so I'm learning Arabic, and then I decided to learn Farsi, which shares the writing system, shares about 15% of the vocabulary with Arabic, but is a Indo-European language. And, of course, once you start studying the history of that region, you see the extent to which, even in the Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, and more so in the Abbasid Caliphate, the Persian speakers and the Turks, who were more of the soldiers, were very influential in those governments. And eventually they would go off and form other countries, and the Turks were very influential in establishing certain, Iranian dynasties, the Safavid dynasty, for example. And if we venture further afield into Central Asia, we see this mixing of Farsi and Turkish in Samarkand and Bukhara and so forth. And if we wander further afield, we'll get to the Uyghurs, who at one point had a powerful state. And even in China during the Tang Dynasty, Turkish soldiers and generals and Persians were very influential. And of course, Buddhism came through the Silk Road. So everything connects. It's connections. And when we learn the language, we learn new words and we connect them to words that we already know, which is why I only ever use a bilingual dictionary. I cannot understand how people can learn a language using a monolingual dictionary where they see explanations in the language they're trying to learn, where they're inevitably going to find many words they don't understand. Connected to words you know, connected to feelings you have, connected to memories you have. When you go to speak, you have to connect what you would like to say. Your utterance has to connect somehow to words and structures that you have in memory that you can pull out and start using. Neurons connect with each other, so it's all about connections. And actually, when we created LingQ, the reason we call it LingQ, not LingQ, and why we went with that word was that, to me, connections, linkages, that is such a big part of language learning. And so I just was thinking about that the other day, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to take you through a bit of a walk through some of the languages I have learned, how they connect, why they connect, and where it helped me and where it didn't help me. So there you have it, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you. Bye.